Okay, today we're going to talk about learning theories, which hopefully is a review from you from chapter 1. Your first study guide touched in on some of this, but I wanted to just reiterate a few things because I think they're significant. And here's the major theories that Gunning talks about in the first chapter, and we'll touch into a little more detail in some of them. The first one being behaviorism, and this one is significant because it is probably through the course of public education, at least in this country, this is one of the major theories that has really been at play and has really pretty much run our classrooms. Typically, a behavioristic classroom has a teacher lecturing, students taking notes, behavioristic charts, maybe for younger kids, stars and behavior kinds of incentives to behave well. So just to get a little brief history, there's a link here to a maybe less than 5 minute video with a little bit of intro to Pavlov, Watson, and Skinner that you can watch. So go ahead and pause the video and take a look at that. Okay, so now we're going to look at cognitivism, and this is looking at how do we think and how does our thinking affect what we do. So there's an internal or mental process in relationship to our observable actions, and both Piaget and Vygotsky can be considered to be cognitivists. So Piaget was significant, but he was the first one that gave us developmental thinking. In other words, looking at children developmentally, instead of just being little adults, he's the first one that classified there is a developmental process. And that gave us the understanding that throughout our lives we have a developmental process. So Erikson has a theory about through our lives, and Maslow's hierarchy of needs, and there are, what's his name, that has sort of a moral developmental theory. But Piaget was really the founder of that. And he was a contemporary with Vygotsky. And Vygotsky was the one who came up with constructivism and social constructivism, meaning that we learn based on who we're around. There's a social quality to it. And that's significant, especially in our diverse society, because if we have children coming from different social backgrounds and different cultures, how they learn and how they view the world is going to be necessarily different. Also, Vygotsky gave us the concept of zone of proximal development, and they talk about this in 470 with that I+1 in language learning as well. So basically, it's where I am right now, what I can do independently, and what I can do with the help from a more knowing person, either an adult, a teacher, or even a peer. Also gave us the concept of scaffolding. So go ahead and pause and watch the video on social cognitivism. Okay, and as you'll probably see in the response sheet, there are questions related to those two videos, so you may want to pause right now and respond to those since they're still fresh in your mind. So, going back to our PowerPoint then, cognitive behavioral approaches are looking at behavior modifications through cognitive principles. So things like self-talk and rewards, which replace faulty learning habits with effective ones. And this can be very impactful too, and something that good teachers typically weave into their classrooms. So why do we care about learning theories? Well, part of this is, again, you want to consider for yourself what is significant, what are your goals of a particular lesson, what techniques will help you achieve those goals, and looking at sort of your perspective on how you're going to teach will also determine how the classroom is organized, what materials you use, student expectations, and so on. So it is important to consider these things, and as I said, you will probably you pull from all these different theories depending on the content you're teaching. For example, behaviorism, well, it is important to use constructivism, for example, to help kids understand, say, the multiplication tables. Maybe they construct, they use blocks, they use hands-on activities to understand how things multiply. But to actually learn the multiplication tables through 12s, you're not going to construct every one of those. It would take forever. So once they've learned the basic concept through constructivism, then maybe using behaviorism to repeat and practice over and over again, that's how they will learn through their multiplication tables. So there's no one strategy that's all good or all bad, or one theory. It's just looking at the content and what's the best way to deliver that content. Okay, so Gunning talks about top-down and bottom-up approaches. And basically, again, it's looking at what is it we're trying to achieve and what's the best way to achieve this. Is it best giving them the big picture first and breaking it down into smaller pieces, which is your top-down? Or is it better giving them the small pieces first? First we learn phonemes, then we learn letters and sounds, and then we build that together to make words. Usually, it's good to go back and forth. We might teach them the big picture first, then break it down, then give them some smaller pieces and build it up. Reader response we will cover more thoroughly in 464, but what we're looking at here really is a relationship between the reader and the text. And who I am as a reader is going to affect what I get out of the text. And I'll give you a great example. Last semester I worked with 10th graders who were struggling, and we were having them read about the Armenian genocide in Turkey in the early 1900s. Well, these kids had very, very little background knowledge. They didn't know anything about Turkey or Armenians, the Armenian people, early 1900s, so it was very difficult for them to make sense of the text. Whereas I have had a deep background and all of that, so reading the information for me was a far different thing. I got more out of it. Your stance is, what's your position? Are you looking at the information because you're looking at, you just want to get information, maybe you're studying for a test and you're reading this book just to look for the facts, or are you reading it because you're connected with the story, it's a novel and you care about the characters? I typically get caught up in the aesthetics of things, and that's why I sometimes have a hard time remembering details, because I don't care about the details and the information as much as I care about the story and what it evokes for me. So the new criticism is looking at the text itself. It's cutting away some of the social, cognitive, and emotional things and focusing more on just what's there on the page and careful analysis and close reading. And this is sometimes seen through the close reading strategies that we get in the Common Core strategies, and cutting away some of the heavy background building that teachers have been doing. So the textbook looks at a combination of these kinds of approaches, and I like the approach the textbook takes, which is why we continue to use it. So when we are reading text, they talk about the reading processors, orthographic, the actual sequence of letters, what's on the page, phonological, connecting letters to sounds, making meaning, and looking at the context. In terms of the literacy initiatives, we have the Elementary and Secondary Act, which was looking at the school to college, school to career, and of course the Common Core standards, which were looking to read more complex texts. They've actually raised the bar for the level of text kids are required to read, meeting more challenging standards, taking aligned assessments, and more information on informational reading and writing. Okay, and I'm going to pause there because some of this we will get into again in week 3. And I know some of the language learning information you have looked at in your 470 class, and we will also look over this again. This is highly significant vocabulary. The research about children that have a lot of vocabulary development before they start school compared to children that don't, sometimes the gaps are so big and so great, they almost can never be mended. Some children come to school knowing a lot of words, some people come to school knowing very little, and it doesn't matter if that knowing is in English or not. If they come to school with a big language background in any language, they're going to be ahead of the game. So we need to support families in providing their children with opportunities to have a lot of language interaction, because we learn vocabulary mostly through interaction, not through direct instruction. Okay, and something else that we will consider through this class and through 464 is how does our culture, how does that impact our understanding of literacy and our value of literacy? What kind of things happen in the home that support this? in one of the big research studies by Shirley Bryce Heath called Way with Words, where she examined two communities in the Appalachia and how does language support happen in these two different communities. And what she found was it's not obvious, and sometimes that language support is not matching what happens in school, but kids are getting a lot of language at home, and we need to learn to value that and bridge what we do at school with what kids get at home. So in terms of the new literacies, and we talked a little bit about this, what are children seeing in terms of online reading and text? And some of the things we need to teach is about how do we determine whether or not what we see in text online is significant? How do we evaluate that information, organize it, and convey it? So here are some of the key points about reading, and if you walk away with this, you've certainly got a lot. First of all, children learn to read by reading. I can't say it enough. If they don't read, they're not going to get better at reading. And typically that's what you find. The kids that are struggling readers, the kids in the 10th grade class I work with, struggle because they didn't learn to read early on, and they kept not reading while their more able peers kept reading, so the gap continued to grow. Instructional needs to be functional and contextual. Teachers need to help kids make connections and promote independence, believe that children can do it, that our program is goal-oriented and systematic, that children are motivated and have a sense of competence. In other words, if they don't believe they can do it, they won't even try. We need to build their language proficiency and monitor their progress. And finally, he talks about what do highly effective teachers do, and I'll let you read that there at the end of the chapter. And essentials for an effective lesson, and we will talk about this in week 3 as well when we talk about designing a word recognition lesson plan.